Hello friends, my name is Katie and welcome back to my channel. Today we are starting another monthly reading vlog of the Wild Book Box. This is a secondhand book subscription service here in Australia that send you books based on your preferences. And I've signed up to get 3 books every month and I'm excited to see what I got this month. Just in case you're new here and you haven't seen my previous Wild Book Box vlogs, basically I'm going to open up this box, take a look at what I've received, and then we're going to do a reading vlog and read these together over the next month. This box is like bulging this month, so I think we've got some thicker books this time. As always, it's beautifully packaged and wrapped, and it's like getting a box full of presents every month. Got a little note saying, "Thanks Katie, enjoy." I'm sure I will. Another bookmark. You can never have too many bookmarks. This is quite a small, cute little book. Ah, yes, another Banana Yoshimoto. I'm so excited. Last month they did send me The Lake by Banana Yoshimoto, which I really enjoyed. And the cool thing about the Wild Book Box, you can completely leave it up to them to surprise you and send you, something new. But they do also tend to post on their Instagram new books that they've found. And so you have the option to request one. And I saw a stack of books that I was really excited about and I requested one, but then also mentioned I wouldn't be mad if this one also arrived. So they kindly sent this one to me. A celebrated actress who has died in mysterious and shocking circumstances leaves behind an unconventional extended family that includes an older sister, a woman in her 20s through whose eyes the story unfolds, a young brother who possesses mystical powers, and a fiancé who is writing a novel with uncanny parallels to his own story. Now, normally with the Wild Book Box, you get a little slip explaining why books were chosen for you, but I essentially just picked this one, so no explanation required. Now for book number 2. Okay, this is the other book I requested. It's A Tale for the Time Being by Ruth Ozeki. Within the pages of this book lies the diary of a girl called Noah. Riding the waves of a tsunami, it is making its way across the ocean. It will change the life of the person who finds it. It might just change yours too. A Tale for the Time Being is a timeless story. Ruth Ozeki beautifully renders not only the devastation of the collision between man and the natural world, but also the often miraculous results of it. Okay, so those are the 2 I essentially picked for myself. Okay, and the 3rd book also seems pretty chunky, so let's find out what this is. And this one should be a surprise, because I don't think I requested anything else, although who knows. I try not to request them because I love the surprise so much, but at the same time, when you see a book that you've been wanting to read or you're really interested in, it's hard to... Okay. I'm excited. Oh my god. I've been wanting to read this book, but it is a tome, right? This is a bit of a classic in Australia. It won the Miles Franklin, I think in 2007. Yes. It's Carpentaria by Alexis Wright. And it's huge. It's huge. Okay, I think this month the Wild Book Box is definitely challenging my big book fear. All of these books are pretty lengthy. They're all over 400 pages and Banana Yoshimoto's the smallest, but its typeset is very small, so a lot of reading to do. And here's my little note explaining why this was chosen for me. And they picked it because I said that I like Australian lit, mythology, gritty, and family. So this is Alexis Wright's 2nd novel. It's an epic that is set in the Gulf country of northwestern Queensland. Wright's storytelling is operatic and surreal, a blend of myth and scripture, politics and farce. The novel teems with extraordinary characters, figures of such an intense imagining they stand like giants in this storm-swept world. Okay, so 3 chunky ass books. And I'm a girl who's scared of anything over 350 pages. Shit. But all books that I am excited for. I basically asked for 2 of them. And this is a book that every time I see it, I'm like, this is a book I would love to read one day. But I never actually pick it up because it's huge. And even though I read 3,000 to 4,000 pages a month, for some reason this, which is less than that total, scares me. This is like a third or maybe even a half of how much I would normally read though. So for those people who ask me how I read 15 books a month, it's because I read short books. So I'm feeling very intimidated right now, but I'm trying to lean into the excitement rather than the anxiety. Those 2 feelings feel way too similar because I think all of these books have the potential to be books that I could really like. Obviously, I've already really enjoyed Banana Yoshimoto. I think the 2 books that I've read from her, I've given 4 stars, so that's pretty solid track record. This one seems like it's going to be very moving and touching, and we all know I love to cry while I read. And I like that I'm finally sort of being pushed to actually read a book that I've always wanted to try. And clearly I have a lot of reading to do, so we should stop talking and get started. Hello, I am here for a check-in for Banana Yoshimoto's Amrita. I am at chapter 10, so about 190 pages in, about a third, not quite a half of the way through. And oh my god, at the moment where I'm at right now, I'm almost scared because all I can think of is please stay good. because I think this could become my favorite book of all time. But let me talk to you about this book so far. So as we discovered at the beginning of this video, reading the blurb, this is a story essentially about quite an eccentric family. Sukumi is the older sister who is like narrating this story for us. And she actually had a head injury not long after the sister passed away, which has resulted in some strange experiences and some memory loss for her. Having said all that, this book is not about really any of those things. This book is more about, you know, this weird family who has had a lot of stuff happen to them, including their father who passed away. But it's about all the small moments in between all of the big stuff. For that reason, it's not a book that I'm like whizzing through. It's not a book that, you know, I want to find out what happens next, so I just can't put it down. Instead, I find almost the opposite happens, where, you know, each chapter is like a small moment with these characters. And so that's how I want to experience it. So it's a character-driven story about a family who's had some stuff happen to them. But what makes this so special is just the writing. I cannot get over the writing. There have been passages in here that are just sort of describing something like a sunset or a meal, that the way that it is expressed is just so sensual. I end up in tears by the end of the passage. Like nothing's happened. It's just a sunset and I'm crying. And all I want to do is read to you these passages. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to read you a few bits. As people, we narrowly get by with our lives each day. Energy from our soft, delicate actions appearing like cherry blossoms, only once, and only for a short while. Eventually, petals fall to the ground. The sun beats down, wind stirs about, and I stand petrified, unable to move, astonished by the sweet colour of the blue sky that flows through the dancing petals of pink tumbling gently about me. The trees above sway softly in the breeze. It happens only once and then it's over, but I eternally melt into that instant. And then this bit is literally her describing a sunset, and it's 2 pages, so I can't read this whole thing to you. I want to, but yeah. I read this like 4 times over and just cried. It's just about a sunset, but it's so good. Oh, screw it. I'm going to read a little bit to you anyway. Outside, we were witnesses to a sunset so dazzling it was frightening. My heart pounded inside me and I felt alive, just in those few minutes we spent staring at the sunset. For the next few minutes, everything was completely different, like something you'd see on TV or a picture from a tourist brochure. And I wondered if I could reach out and touch it. Everything was surrounded by a force that squeezed its way in through an invisible wall between the air and town, a gigantic energy that burned softly in its own clarity, a vividness so fresh I almost stopped breathing. Feeling my soul wake inside me, I felt something tug at my chest as the sunset finally disappeared over the horizon, giving me a sense of invigorating gratitude and a feeling of not wanting to part. I knew I would never see another day like that one. The perfect composition of the sky, the formation of the clouds, the colours, the warmth, they'd never come back. Over the course of our lives, each one of us reads a million books and sees as many films. We kiss our loved ones the same number of times. But I was aware I'd seen something that night that I'd never see again in my lifetime. I think it's the way that the beautiful sits in tandem with the sad. For me, that is something that I just really identify with. Like every time I'm at like a gig for a band I've always wanted to see, I find it so hard to stay in the moment because I'm just thinking about the fact that this will be the only time I see them. Or, you know, when I'm having a wonderful moment with Blair and we've just had like the most delightful kiss ever, I have like this joy and this sadness that exists simultaneously because I know that he is not forever, I am not forever, and we will never have that kiss again. I feel like every time I'm experiencing true beauty, I'm also grieving for the fact that it's momentary. And I feel like that is what this book is capturing to the point where I'm just like moved the whole time. So right at this moment, I could not be more thrilled with my experience of this book. And I love it so much. Oh my God. Hello friends, welcome to my new reading chair. So this book took me like 9 or 10 days to finish. I know some people say that this is slow, that it has no plot, that it's pointless, that it's too long. And I totally get where people are coming from. But for some reason, I loved it. I loved all of it. I mentioned in the last clip how there's a lot of talk about grief, especially because the main character, her sister and father have passed away before the book starts. And so that sort of grief really impacts her and her family. But then also the fact that the main character had that head injury that resulted in a lot of loss of memory. She's sort of had her own touch with death as well. And at one point, one character describes her as half dead. And she also describes the experience as having been reborn, like she feels different now. So there is a lot of exploration of death and mortality. And as with everything else in this book, I just felt like it was done in a way that was both beautiful and sad. And both of those things existed in every single line, in every single word. And I think that's what I loved so much about all of it. I do think this is one of the most beautiful books I've ever read, and one of the best reading experiences I've ever had. Overall though, this was a 5-star read without doubt. I loved it. This will be certainly one of my favourite books of the year, and I think it will be one of those books that I reference as a favourite of all time. I loved it, and I want to read everything this author has ever read, and I have ordered 3 more of her books, and I can't wait for them to arrive. So, this is such a heavy book. I'm going to get stuck into Carpentaria now. I mean, it's only 520 pages, but something about this just feels so heavy. I think because it's also quite like, you know, a large book. Like, Amrita has nothing on this. It's like, it feels very heavy and very big. Like, this is not going to fit in my backpack. It's huge. So I know for you it's just been a jump cut, but for me it feels like it's been an age. I have been reading this book for I think 10 or 11 days at this point. I'm at page 308, which is chapter 10. So I am a little over halfway, but this thing is work. It is set in the town of Desperance, which is a fictional town sort of like up in North Queensland in the Gulf of Carpentaria. And it's just a story about this community and the people living in this town. We are especially focusing on a few people. I think primarily Norm Phantom seems like the main character of this book, or at least a big part of it. He is an Aboriginal man who's like a fisherman, and then also his wife Angel Day. It's not always super like linear and clear to me all the time, but at the same time it never feels like I like don't know what's going on. Does that make sense? And this town, there's just a lot of tension. Like a lot of racial tension is certainly at the heart of this, but then I think there's also like some gendered issues and some class issues and some like just historical grievances between different groups, stuff like that. There's a lot of like active on the surface tension, but then there's a lot more sort of lying beneath the surface. So it's actually quite an uncomfortable read. I don't want to like oversimplify any comparison, but just like an emotional sort of comparison that I drew early on, or about a quarter of the way through, was of when I read Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye. Not because there's any like big comparisons between like, I don't know, characters or like story or anything, but just in terms of a feeling. I remember when I did the Wild Book Box vlog for that book, I kept describing that book as like harsh, and like the people in it feeling harsh, and like circumstance has made these people have to kind of be hard to one another in order to survive. And that's sort of like this learned behavior of this survival mechanism. And I think there's elements of that sort of presenting itself in this book, at least of my reading of it. It is dense. The chapters are so long. The paragraphs are long. The sentences are long. That is a big part of why I'm not really getting through this book very quickly. But also just it feels, what's the word? It's almost like a trance-like, I feel like, when you're reading this book. It's almost like the air is thicker in Desperance, and when you're reading it, you sort of feel that too. And one of the things that I do really like about it in particular is like the animistic sort of way that particularly Norm is describing his experience of the world. You know, like the wind talks to him and stuff like that. Like I find that it's really, really beautiful, and the way that it's done is just really seamless and it's lovely. So there's a lot I'm liking about it, but I'm not finding it easy to read. I'm not finding it a page turner. The other thing I'll say at this point is I did realize that I have got the audiobook for this. A long time ago, I was subscribed to Audible, and I sort of racked up a few extra credits. And then when I decided I didn't want to be part of Audible, and I use Libro FM and my library and Scribd and stuff now, if you cancel your subscription, you lose any unused credits, but you do keep the books that you've already used credits on. So I sort of went through and bought a bunch of books with these credits that I had, and then cancelled my subscription. And one of the books I did that with was Carpentaria, because like I've said, I've always wanted to read this book, but it intimidated me. So I think I just must have 2 or 3 years ago decided that I'd have more luck maybe getting around to the audiobook. And so what I've been doing, not the whole book, but for the last maybe 3 chapters, is like sitting reading with the book, but also having the audiobook in my ears as well. Anyway, that's my update for now. I will hopefully update you in a few days. It's only 200 pages. I could read that in a day, but for some reason it's hard with this book. But that is not to say that I'm not enjoying it. So I'll talk to you soon. I finished Carpentaria last night. And I don't even know how to begin to talk about this book. I kind of feel like this is one of the best books I've ever read. Even though it's only just over 500 pages, it feels like the longest book that I've ever read. And I can't really say that I enjoyed the reading experience. I think Alexis Wright managed to create something entirely unconventional with this book. It doesn't feel like a novel. It feels like an epic oral myth put down into words. And I think she achieved that through these larger than life characters that really do feel like they exist beyond the now, that they are bigger than the here and now. They feel eternal. I have heard people before say that one of the things that white people tend to really struggle to comprehend about Aboriginal culture and storytelling is like the eternal existence of dreaming. Like that the dream time wasn't some origin story that's in the past, that dreaming continues to exist like alongside, within everything. And I think that's one thing that this book captures really well. Like the mythological and the magical and the spiritual and the ancestors don't feel like some past story. They feel like they are present, both within the landscape and within the characters that we get to know in this book. They don't feel like they just belong to the here and now, basically. They feel so much bigger. This book is really hard to read, not only because like the sentences are so long and the chapters are so long that it has this sort of like dreamlike quality that it brings forth really effectively, but also just in terms of the literal content. Like there's hate crimes, like explicit hate crimes. There's like abuse of a disabled person. There's a lot of violence and just like crappy stuff that goes on. And I think like that is relevant to the book because there's so much tension in this town, in this small town. If we're going to talk about the plot, it is very much centered around a mine that has come to the region and is providing jobs and opportunity for people, but then is also obviously negatively impacting the environment quite significantly. It's a very, very large mine. And on top of that, there's questions around native title. So people within the town respond differently to this mine coming. Even within the Aboriginal people, there's not consensus, which, you know, is true. No group is a monolith. And even within households, that tension of how like Aboriginal people should be sort of living, should be trying to, I don't know, like assimilate or not, sort of like rebel or retaliate or not. Like there's a lot of questions around that and how different people sort of respond to the situation of not only the mine, but like the bigger topic of dispossession and invasion. And then there's also just a lot of lingering grief and trauma, both from the past, but like, as we know, racism and white supremacy and the violence of colonialism continues to exist today. And that's very relevant in here too. There's so many different themes and sort of threads that you can pull apart and pick through in this book. It's incredibly layered, incredibly dense, but still some of the most beautiful, moving writing I have ever read. It feels like a declaration of survival and perseverance in a way that feels foretold. I'm left just feeling hugely moved. And I don't know, I feel like it's changed me in some way. And I don't know that I can put into words just yet exactly what that is. I know it's a tome, but this is the Australian novel you need to read. I can't get over it. I think it's one of the greatest achievements of literature I've ever read. Like that is not to say this is my new favorite book. I think I adored Amrita in a way that I did not adore this book. And yet I just cannot help but respect this in a way that I don't think I've ever respected any other book. So even though I was sort of cursing the Wild Book Box for making me read this with how long it took me, I mean, I think it took me almost 2 weeks, which for 500 pages, I would normally read that in less than a week, you know, overall between books. So it definitely took me at least twice as long as I was expecting to read. And a part of me didn't like that. But I promise you, if you just be patient with this book, it is well worth the effort. And I don't know that I would have ever gotten around to it had I not sort of been prompted by the Wild Book Box. So I cannot thank you enough. So this has been a pretty intense and lengthy update. I know we've still got one more book to go. It's pretty chunky too, although I don't imagine it's going to be as dense as this. I might take the day off and then we will start tomorrow. So I could not have been any more wrong if I'd tried. I feel like in a way, this Wild Book Box almost put me into a reading slump. Each book took me longer to read than the last. I thought I had a rough time with Carpentaria taking about 2 weeks. This took 3. And although I'm aware I sound like I'm just complaining, I think this might be the best Wild Book Box I've ever received. A Tale for the Time Being by Ruth Ozeki is a very difficult read. It's beautiful. The sort of format and the setup I think is really cool. It's one of those books where we get a few different perspectives. The first is a 16-year-old girl living in Japan called Now. And we get her perspective through a memoir or a diary that she's written. She's writing about her own life, which has been quite difficult in a lot of ways. Her childhood was spent in America when her father was working for a big tech company. And then when the dot-com bubble burst, they had to come back to Japan, and her father struggled to find work and they didn't have a lot of money. Now struggled to sort of assimilate, I guess, back into Japanese culture, and she was severely bullied throughout her school years. Her father is suicidal, and at one point Now is sort of sent to stay for the summer with her great-grandmother, Jiko. Jiko is a Buddhist nun, and the relationship that Jiko and Now develop throughout the story is really touching. Through that, we also learn quite a bit of history about Japan, especially in World War II, and just the realities and horrors of that situation. And then the other perspective that we get is a middle-aged woman living in Canada named Ruth. And she discovers Now's diary or memoir on the beach in a Ziploc bag. It's washed up on the shore in Canada. So we sort of alternate between their perspectives. We get one chapter from Now, a little bit of her diary, and then a chapter from Ruth sort of just processing what she's read by Now, and then also trying to like understand who Now is and sort of track her down, learn a bit more about her and her family, as well as just sort of processing and connecting with Now in her own experience. There is a little bit of a mystical sci-fi speculative element as well, which was interestingly done, and there's a lot of Zen philosophy throughout as well. So there's so much about this that I loved. I loved that format of this diary, and someone reading the diary and sort of trying to figure out who this young girl is. But having said that, this was such a difficult book to read, largely because of how dark a lot of the content is. Multiple characters in this book have their own sort of journey, experience with suicide and suicidal ideation, and a lot of it's very explicit. There's also a lot of details about war, the horrors of war. The bullying that Now experiences is like not a bit of name calling. Not that that's ever acceptable, but it's like, it's horrific, some of the things that happen to her. And just the fact that it's a 16-year-old girl trying to process all of this, and she's sort of forced to grow up long before she should. And I don't know how many trigger warnings to offer you because I don't want to give stuff away. Because at the beginning, Now starts out with some innocence still remaining. And as her story unfolds, you sort of watch her lose so much of that. I'm sure there will be trigger warnings listed on GoodReads, for example. So if you're interested in reading this book and those are sort of topics that concern you, I'd certainly look into that. For those of you who don't know, I have a diagnosis of bipolar disorder, and I was hospitalized in 2013 after an overdose suicide attempt. So I found this triggering. I'm doing a lot better these days, but still reading about this sort of stuff in such explicit detail, I find very difficult. Clearly it wasn't enough to make me put the book down completely. I think because the characters, particularly of Now and Ruth, I just found so compelling. They were really, really well done and really fleshed out. But for that reason, I did have to take my time. I really found it difficult to read more than a chapter or two at once, and sometimes I really had to give myself a space from the book for a few days. So all of that is to say, this was a very difficult book for me to read, but there was a lot about it that I really, really loved. Obviously, I have my own personal thoughts about how suicide was spoken about and represented. Sometimes I felt like I'd almost never read anything so honest and raw regarding suicide, and like the complexities of those emotions and how it messes with a person's sense of reality. And I feel like the book captured that very well in a lot of circumstances. And so whilst I appreciated a lot of that, there were some situations where I did feel like the narrative of suicide being like a selfish choice, an act of cowardice, or even something that you can just sort of decide to snap out of. Sometimes those stereotypes did bleed into this book. The book also incorporates explorations of so many other topics though, like we talk a little bit about like September 11, as well as the tsunami in Japan. There's also quite a lot of like sciencey talk around climate, environment, and like physics. And although all of those threads did tie together, sometimes it did feel a little longer than maybe it needed to be. Ultimately though, I gave it 4 stars because I've never read anything like this. And the dynamic between Ruth and Now, and the sort of mystery and the sort of, I don't know, synchronicities between them were really beautiful. It was just a really interesting, compelling read, and I think Now, the character of Now, was so well done, and she really was the heart of this. I should probably get the other 2 books. So, to sum up, this Wild Book Box was perhaps the most challenging for me. These books took me a good 2 months to get through all 3 of them. And last month I read like half the amount I normally would, and in large part I think that was due to A Tale for the Time Being and Carpentaria. Both were just very dense books, both in terms of like the length of them, but then also in terms of their content, and I found them both difficult to get through. But all of these books, I am so glad I read. Like, The Tale for the Time Being was my least favorite out of them, and I still gave it 4 stars. I think from a personal point of view, Amrita was certainly my favorite. I adored Amrita, and I'm desperate to read everything Banana Yoshimoto has ever written. And then from like a reader's perspective, I'm so glad I read Carpentaria. I think, like I said, this is one of the best books I've ever read. I'm just so impressed by it. I'm more or less in awe, and whenever I think about it, I get emotional. And like I said, it's been a book I've always wanted to read. So to sort of have that push to finally get around to it, I'm really glad that I did. And even though it was difficult, it was a really rewarding experience. So 3 long, difficult, dense, emotional books that I couldn't be happier that I read. I mean, a 5, and a 4 star. I think that has to be the best average rating of any Wild Book Box by far. And I think this has confirmed that this year I've found a new favourite author in Banana Yoshimoto too. But that is all from me. Thank you so much for watching. I will talk to you again soon, and until then, so much love. Bye.